So good morning, members of the Department of Philosophy. This is Joyce Arriola. I thank the department for inviting me to present a lecture in relation to the general theme of the CPE seminar, Understanding Society, Culture, and Religion. I told Dr. Carino if I could develop something around religion and literature, and because that's within my understanding too, I wish to be able to address society, but somehow I felt that when you cover religion, perhaps you would already be touching on society. So I felt that this topic is appropriate in the light of uh, the general theme of the conference. I chose to work on the two old essays by um, Giles Gunn, Religion and Literature, Literature and Religion, and T.S. Eliot's Religion and Literature. These are two old develop the two domains as interrelated domains, no? Not as separate domains, but interrelated domains. So my next slide, please. This presentation um, is a close reading of the two essays that explain the link between religion and literature. T.S. Eliot's canonical essay, Religion and Literature, is important as it is one of the treatises that lay down a moral framework for literature in the modern times. Giles Gunn gives a view of the link between literature and religion from a historical perspective, including updates on how religion is tackled in modern literature and how contemporary literary theory may be utilized to analyze its current usage. The lecture will begin with Gunn's historical analysis, then it will insert Eliot's definition of religious literature in the middle. Then it will return to Gunn's update on contemporary uses of the notion and concluding discussions. So it will start with Gunn, then I will insert Eliot in the middle, and then I will return to Gunn. Because in the middle, Gunn mentioned the pioneering work of T.S. Eliot. So I'll insert Eliot's work there and then return to Gunn. So this is going to be a close reading, like exegetical, because I cannot anymore add to what they have said, except that there may be some examples that I would like to suggest as we go along the concepts that they have laid down. The lecture also encourages the cooperation between philosophy and literature in crystallizing these concepts of religion and theology that inspire and animate artistic and cultural practices. This is ultimately proposed as an exercise in interdisciplinary discussion and collaboration. So the attempt is at an interdisciplinary discussion, not separately, but as they go together. Before I move on to the next slide, I would like to cite the limitations of this reading. First, these examples, the examples given in this lecture and in these essays rather, are from the Western literary tradition. These are really from Western examples. So these are mostly canonical. So the Filipino examples are somehow perhaps I can suggest, but they are not too many. And then another limitation is it is really a Western theory. No, whatever is proposed in this interdisciplinary engagement is a prospective concept theory, or yes, theory. So there is a need for us to theorize on a Philippine interrelationship between Philippine religion, Philippine religious and literary studies. And another limitation perhaps is that I did not anymore cover society, as I felt that these are already covered in the religious texts, embedded, or religious culture embedded in the text. Next slide, please. The references. Okay, in the references, you can find the essays in these books, Religion and Literature from Five Approaches of Literary Criticism, T.S. Eliot's essay, but you will find it in other anthologies. It's an older essay. It's older, meaning this anthology is 1962. The source is 1962, but it may have been written earlier than that, perhaps the 1920s. Giles Gunn's Literature and Religion is found in Interrelations of Literature, Baricelli and Ghibaldi, 1982. This is being taught in classes of comparative literatures. For example, literature in the social sciences. So the subject matter delves on how literature somehow may be studied alongside the social sciences. Next slide, please. In his introduction to the essay Literature and Religion, Giles Gunn tackles the long-running link between literature and religion, which dates back to the time when literature was intimately connected with myth and ritual. So let us begin by saying that in the ancient times, there was no the notion of literature. No notion of literature. Literature is a much later invention. So you only have religion, you only have belief, you only have myth and ritual. So when they go to a temple and they say a prayer or they perform a drama in honor of a god or a goddess, that drama is art. But the notion of art is that it is embedded in ritual. Therefore, there's no art form to begin with. To an ancient person, an ancient men and women, there was only myth and ritual. Walter Benjamin also said this in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Art was a much later conception. So whatever definition we have of art, whatever definition we have of literature came very much later, when you have this dissociation of art from the notion of art from the notion of belief. So when you look at from ritual to romance, for example, Jesse Weston. You have all the myths, all the romances from the age of antiquity, and somehow this came down. These were handed down to us as narratives, and later on we gave them a name: epics, metrical tale. But they weren't metrical romance in those days. These weren't called epics in those days. They were just called ritual. In the same manner that Sir James George Fraser, who discussed practices of magic and religion all over the world from the dawn of civilization, said that many of these rituals made use of what we now refer to as literary forms. Therefore, from the very beginning, art wasn't art. It was only belief. It was only religious culture. There was religious culture before there was the concept of art. Not that there was not an art form. It's just that the concept of art form came very much later. Next slide, please. The link between literature and religion may be expressed in the literary genres and traditions that have been influenced by religion. So belief came first, and then you have the forms, you have the genres. And the genres in form and content follow the spirit of the ritual. For example, the medieval allegory. The medieval allegory is in support or has been used in order to present the Christian faith in medieval times, no? So you will find this in miracle plays. You will find this in moral dramas. And they became allegorical because you will, for example, have a literal story. This literal story may be interpreted in a metaphorical way. And then it will be interpreted in an allegorical way, larger culture, in terms of larger context. So you have three levels of interpretation there. So you may have a dramatic form that may talk of both secular and religious topics. Now, this medieval allegory is very important to the Filipinos because during the Spanish colonization, these miracle plays, these medieval dramas were brought to the country, and they were presented and somehow have been introduced to the natives, so that our current forms, our folk forms, such as the Passion, such as the Santa Cruzan, were actually extensions of the drama, staged dramas, and now they were brought from the platform to the streets. So the medieval allegories are very important to us. In fact, until now, the influences of the medieval allegory would still be around in our soap operas and our dramas. So you have the belief shaping the form. 17th century metaphysical poetry, tackling, for example, even medieval subjects. But during the 17th century, you have the Reformation, one century after the Reformation, you have poems about creation, the fall. You have poems about Christ and the second coming, etc. Now, John Donne came from a Catholic family, but eventually he converted to Anglicanism. But if you read his poetry, you will still see remnants of his Catholic beliefs, because they were talking of sacraments, they were talking of redemptive suffering and all that. And of course, those were not exactly Anglican, but more of Catholic theology. Ralph Waldo Emerson, and not only him, but also Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, and Rabindranath Tagore later on, uh, except for Tagore, these were American transcendentalists. And so these poets are drawing from their religious beliefs. And Tagore eventually, from India, Rabindranath Tagore would have would have what you call his own version of transcendentalism. So these works have been animated by religious beliefs. So without those religious beliefs, these forms may be drawing from elsewhere. But even as I would say later on, uh, even the most secular of topics may have been animated by some religious precepts that a writer have in his consciousness. So it's deeply embedded there. Next slide, please. And even the Elizabethan tragedies, romantic poetry, most especially romantic poetry, because, okay, romantic poetry, the impulse is individualism, the call to freedom, a certain kind of protest. And where is that coming from? That is coming from the belief that the person must be able to exercise his freedom to express, and that he should not be limited by the rigors given by the classicists, handed down by the classicists. So romantic poetry being a kind of protest, there must be something religious, quote unquote, about romantic poetry. And so when we read the poems of Charles Baudrillard and his gang, you would see there is some there are some elements of some personal religion or personal theology, as you can perhaps um, ascribe to their writings. Elizabethan tragedy being patterned or somehow working from previous traditions, although the Renaissance somehow developed their own forms, you still have the influences from medieval forms. And I pointed out here Eugene Ionesco. Eugene Ionesco being a writer following the tradition of the theater of the absurd. Being somebody who talks about modernity, the failure of modern man, usually his topics would delve on breakdown in communication. He is lamenting the failure of modernity. And what is modernity all about? What is the failure of modernity all about? But relativism and secularism and disengagement from a higher power. So the themes of Eugene Ionesco may be indirectly linked to uh, religious notions or lack thereof by um, modern artists, including, of course, number four, literary conventions draw from religious conceptions such as the heroic play. Normally in the sonnet, you have the last two lines, the heroic play, where you have the parang, you have the aral, no, you have the moral. And normally this is a comment about life. And that comment about life somehow points to a religious notion. Another example is the unreliable narrator. Uh, in postmodern literature, you have, of course, we have to go back to the modern literature. Let's say the modern novel. You have a reliable narrator, and a reliable narrator is omniscient most of the time. Or let's say somebody who's all-knowing, who has control of the narrative, who has control of everything. But in postmodern novels, you have an unreliable narrator. You cannot trust his narrative, whether his narrative is valid, whether his narrative is true, or he is unreliable. So you have there the limits of human knowledge. And of course, it's pointing to the power, the um the omnipotence of God, no? The limitations of man um, is pointing to the omnipotence of the divine. No? So that is somehow linked to religion according to Kant. Next, you have the current critical methods draw from beyond aesthetic concepts, which draw from religious precepts of old. So while critical methods like new criticism and deconstruction are not only using aesthetic concepts, but also convey an ontology that are drawn from reality and are almost philosophical in orientation. In a manner of speaking, although modern literature veers away from the theological discussion, religious questions are still found to be central to it. So they may be talking about the modern realities, but somehow you know that the subtext is theological or even, let us say, religious. Next slide, please. Religion and literature, some misunderstanding. One misunderstanding is that it is confined to modern period. No, of course you have it from the dawn of civilization, from the dawn of literacy. The misunderstanding is that we the connection between religion and literature, the scholastic understanding, critical understanding is confined to modern period. It's because you have only scholars writing about that critically in the modern times. Because in the olden times, in older periods, they are not so conscious of it. They know that the link is strong, but somehow uh, the critical works came out mostly in the modern period. And mostly are Anglo-American scholars. And this is curious because they are mostly British and American, like T.S. Eliot, talking about the wasteland. They are drawing from European existentialism. So they have been influenced by European literature, more specifically the existentialist tradition before, in between the First and Second World War. So you have this formal understanding, no? So when you say it's a misunderstanding. It means that perhaps the critical works, the scholarly works came belatedly. But even before, perhaps in literary production, the writers, we cannot say they are not conscious that they are bringing in religious concepts in their works. Secondly, another misunderstanding is it is limited to Judeo-Christian concerns. So, and normally you may, the writer may either vindicate his or her belief or censure others. So it's not limited to Judeo-Christian concerns, maybe on Islam, maybe on Hinduism, maybe on Buddhism. In fact, maybe about New Age, perhaps. But of course, since our limitation is that we understand these terms from the Judeo-Christian perspective, because we are Christians and because we are teaching in a Catholic university, we limit our understanding of or our critical works to Judeo-Christian concerns. But of course, uh, we have Dr. Ko and other Asianists who work on Hinduism or Buddhism. A great number of them working in other world religions or belief systems. Next slide, please. One complaint against this religion. So this presentation I am giving you now is not only about examples of literary works that have been influenced by religion or religion seeping into religious works, but also we're talking of scholarship on literature and religion, the interrelationship between the two. So there's complaint about the apparent provincialism in that. That's the problem normally when you're dealing with interdisciplinarity. Normally, let's say if you talk of religion and literature, religion and media, normally the complaint is you will have you will promote one and neglect the other. You will emphasize one and you neglect the other. That is always the problem with interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, perhaps. But it doesn't mean we should not pursue it. So this is something that we have to be reminded about. It's the accusation that it is provincial, provincial accusation that is being, what do you call this? The accusation of its apparent provincialism. So those who are sympathetic to the literature religion connection could not go beyond apologetic theology. So how do you do that? How do you do that without being apologetic? Let us say if you're a Catholic writer and you're talking about church and it's a work of fiction and you have a character who is a devout Catholic, and of course the theology that you tackle there is the Catholic theology. So are you an apologist for the Catholic Church? So how do you deal with that? That becomes a tricky part, no? How do you forward an idea without being accused of being an apologist? And also, is there anything wrong with being an apologist? I think in the University of Santo Tomas, that is our job as professors, at least the Catholics in our ranks, among our ranks, to somehow introduce our faith in our lessons. We are professors in a Catholic university. So just because you are upholding matters of faith does not make you an apologist. And then even if you are an apologist and a good one at that, is there anything wrong about it if you are a Catholic educator? And another one among those sympathetic is that it emphasizes aesthetics and culture, theory of aesthetics and culture, being formal, being rigid about form, conventions, elements, knowledge of formal and structural properties of literature that legitimate religious analysis. Somehow the form has something to do with it. So if you have a very well-written piece, because it's well-written, you feel that the theology is also legitimate or valid or believable, because the form is a winner, no? The form allows you to uh, follow the belief. So those are um, the elements of, you know, those are somehow what they say about um, to those who are sympathetic to the interrelationship. How about those who are suspicious of the interrelationship? They said that it is insensitive to the intimate connection between the study of literature and religion. Perhaps there's something missing. Perhaps they are being reductionists. Perhaps it's a lame theology. Perhaps it's too dogmatic. Perhaps it's too what, neat and pat, no? Very difficult to include religion without being moralistic or dogmatic. And another one is those suspicious said that there is also an insensitivity to the religious crisis of cultural modernism. That there is a crisis. There is a crisis of faith. And that is the problem. So we don't tackle belief anymore. We don't tackle religion anymore because there is this crisis. Perhaps started, we always associate that with the 20th century, the Second World War or the First World War, but perhaps it began during the Renaissance. And from there on, you have the fall of man. And that crisis must be tackled, must be discussed in a very sensitive way. So the problem of religion has become a problematic since the Renaissance. Therefore, to contain that in a piece of art or a work of literature may be too huge a project according to those who are suspicious of the collaboration. Next slide, please. So therefore, the relationship between religion, I'm following Gunn's presentation. These are his thoughts, and that I'm doing a close reading of. I'm just trying to explain his examples because, of course, he would be enumerating his examples, but he would not have the time or nor the space to explain why these are his examples. And I would like to pause at this moment to talk about how useful this can be to our philosophy professors, because this is a CPE for the philosophy professors. And I know that somehow some of these people that have been mentioned in the essay are also the scholars that philosophy professors study and teach. And so you can help out the literature department by giving, perhaps engaging in a co-sponsored seminars that can tackle how these philosophers may help in giving us a background on some of the literary works that somehow tackle religion. So we can help each other. As I said in the abstract, this is a call for collaborative engagement between philo and lit, and perhaps communication, history, and etc. So the relationship between literature and religion are various and complex. First, Gan said, it can be a way of confirming or at least shoring up belief. He gave us examples: Sir Philip Sidney, Leo Tolstoy, and T.S. Eliot. Of Eliot, I would like to emphasize how Eliot would be shoring up belief or confirming. One thing about T.S. Eliot is that he's both complaining about modern life, and at the same time, he would uphold religious beliefs that that somehow are crucial in helping contemporary men face this crisis of modernity. So he called our modern life a wasteland. He has a work titled The Wasteland. Most of the time, he would be talking of the crisis of morality, the crisis of, perhaps he may be referring, he is talking of modern forms of evil, warfare, genocide, and all that. Some of these symbolisms are very rich, but you know very well that because he wrote during the period of in between two world wars, he must be referring to those problems of modern life. So by training our attention on those, he was also trying to uphold some of the values of people who struggle to confront the problems of modern life. So there is something both, it's both positive and negative, or pessimistic and optimistic about Eliot's way of shoring up belief. Secondly, you have as a way of challenging or disconfirming belief. The examples given by Gunn are Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, Miguel de Unamuno, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre would talk about the literature of despair. It came during his time when the modern world that T.S. Eliot was talking about has fallen really into the abyss. So Sartre was dealing with that in his works, dramas, novels, and somehow gave us, when you read him, somehow it gave us though he was shoring up a literature of despair, somehow we are being pointed to something bigger or something higher that we can run to, no? So that we will find hope in the midst of this crisis. So you can have somebody disconfirming belief, and yet the effect of the literary work to you is more of strengthening your belief. No, you can have a very dark writer but somehow it will point you towards something more hopeful um, as a result of that. Next slide, please. Relations between literature and religion continuing. Um, as a way of preparing for or inducing belief. Examples given were Longinus, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Paul Valéry. I will talk of Longinus on the Sublime, period of antiquity. He was talking of poetry as the echo of the soul. So, I don't know, perhaps Longinus was a very inspired writer. He said that when you write and you write well, you are expressing the echo of your soul. So that he can distinguish between a bad writer and a good writer. And a good writer is somebody whose soul uh, can lead you to transport, no? Yung sinasabi niyang sublime. Kaya I think sa kanya galing yung word na yun, ano? I'm not very sure. Sublimation. And that is a way of preparing for inducing belief. Although he's a pagan writer, uh, he first century or second century um, before Christ, I think he mentioned there in on the Sublime that a good writer, a great poet, can draw from sources higher than himself, higher than his reality. And that reality is coming from above. But he was short of saying that is coming from God. He was short of saying that. But somehow, you could deduce from his writing that he's talking about higher power. Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, one of the most, what, rebellious of the romantic poets, ng manginginom, basta maraming bisyo. But you know, his poetry was really what you call echoes of the soul. If you use the Longinian formula, he was the one who said that the poet is the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. So they are unacknowledged because they are not given that appointment, no, by a secular administrator. But somehow they take on upon themselves to be the legislator of mankind, to bear the moral concepts that must guide mankind through their poetry. So that's the romantic in him talking. They want to somehow hand down high concepts that may be that may be inspired or divinely inspired. One thing about these romantics, they are not exactly talking about God. They were talking of a higher power, but they would sometimes be short of referring to a God, but somehow you know that they are referring to something that is higher than their earthly powers or their skills as a writer. Fourth, as legitimating religious notions, reconceptualizing them, repossessing them, relativizing them, demystifying them, confounding them, and even whether intentionally or not, undermining them. That's a mouthful. But you have these writers from ancient times to medieval down to Renaissance, Gilgamesh epic, Beowulf, El Cid, The Journey to the West, Dante's Divina Commedia, Chao Chin's The Dream of the Red Chamber. I would like to discuss briefly Dante, being, of course, one of those who tried to legitimize, reconceptualize, repossess, relativize, demystify, confound these notions, for being able to come up with that La Divina Commedia, no? In three parts: Inferno, Paradiso, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And so, while it was deep theology, knowledge of medieval theology that inspired him to write his opus, somehow he was also reconceptualizing medieval theology. We have no physical notion of hell. We only know hell from the scriptures until the Middle Ages. Until the Middle Ages, the monks, perhaps, who would be writing in scriptoria, would imagining, for example, what hell is about. And perhaps you will find from time to time some images from the Apocalypse treated in those beautiful stained glass windows. But you do not really have a physical conception of hell until Dante came along and gave us a very vivid picture of what hell is all about. And of course, somehow, though the church had a awkward relationship with that piece of work, the church did not confirm nor deny the validity of Dante's conception of hell. Therefore, it became useful too in propagating a concept not only of hell but also purgatory. Remember that a century later, it will be questioned by the reformists, this concept of purgatory. So, El Cid too is this is a very interesting piece, no? Because El Cid is about El Cid is a religious epic and a secular epic at the same time. It's pointing to God, but at the same time, you have some disturbing scenes in the epic, particularly pointing to the feudal culture of the Middle Ages, specifically in Spain, the warring kingdoms in Spain. But then you also have their ethos or values of honor, courage, bravery, filial piety played out in that epic somehow. So, on the one hand, you have that hierarchy, medieval hierarchy, that sometimes oppresses the peasants or the but and then on the other you have these values played out, that are positive values somehow and that have been handed down to other generation. So next slide, please. The next one has to do with the subtle and perplexed relations. These are texts that are cosmological and anthropological in orientation, such as Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, Lady Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji, and the Chanson de Roland, Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Cresseide. So you have something very perplexing, like the tale of Genji. You have uh, you have Buddhism deeply embedded in the text, but somehow it can be perplexing because of the sexual permissiveness of Prince Genji, uh, taboos, um, some images of adultery and some kind of immoralities, and then you will be perplexed at how this could be found in the same text, no? How you can find all of these indiscretions found in a supposedly religious text. So those are some of the next slide, please. Problematic issues on the relations between literature and religion. And then you have another set of issues that are really problematic, bordering on the different conceptions of belief itself, of course, and religion's general relation to culture. These are two-pronged, no? So, on conceptions of different conceptions of belief, one is subconscious commitment found in individual works. Some are not overt, some are only subtle. So, you may have, for example, Hinduism in texts like Mahabharata and Ramayana, but somehow it's played out uh, through the plot or through the episodes. So therefore, though the works are developing the theme Hindu uh, of Hindu belief in the themes, somehow these are played out through the conventions of the epic. And some are unconscious and half-conscious concerns that constitute the general worldview or metaphysical frame of mind that particular texts, like whole traditions, seem to reflect. For example, the Scarlet Letter. No? So you have the presumption that the reader knows about the Puritan America. When the Puritans, when the Anglicans who left England and settled in America, uh, came up with a new a version of the Church of England religion, no? A version of the Church of England, and you have the Puritan values played out in the Scarlet Letter, for example. You have to understand why such rigor and why such doctrinal uh, theology played out in the text. So if you're reading this novel, you must have a background on the religious life of colonial America or even post-colonial America. So they can be played out in a conscious way, unconscious way, half-conscious way. Next slide, please. Different conceptions of belief. Some understanding are limited to great historic faiths such as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. So our understanding, for example, would be limited to Judeo-Christian, perhaps more on Catholic Christianity, because that's what we that's our cradle belief. So though Jewish and Christian religions would read, for example, the book of Leviticus, we give, as Christians, we give the book of Leviticus perhaps our own reading of the book of Leviticus perhaps is slightly different from how the Jews would read the book of Leviticus. But we both understand that these are works of literature too. And so, when we read the book of Leviticus, either we don or we don this, or we wear the Jewish glasses, so to speak, and read it based on Hebraic tradition, or as part of Christian tradition, wherein we know that everything in the New Testament has been foretold in the Old. So we should have an understanding of the Old Testament. So very important to us when we read the New Testament is to read, to understand to the Old, because everything's been prefigured in the Old. So it is limited to that. So when we tackle, for example, a book in the Bible, and you bring it in a novel, for example, some references, thematic references, or intertextual references, our understanding would be limited to our affiliation. Fourth, a minority pay attention to some forms of belief that are theologically heterodox or metaphysically irregular, modalities of belief that lack an assured name, or those that seem to originate from within those unspeakable experiences behind creed or conviction. So there are times when historical experiences led us to believe in certain things that originate from some theological precepts. One example would be the Merchant of Venice. If we, for example, reread Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, and you have the depiction of the Jew in the Merchant of Venice, and it's disturbing, because it seems that the Jew is presented as usurious, and you would say, did Shakespeare participate in this anti-Semitic bias, this bias against the Jews, anti-Semitism, bias against the Jews, because it's a popular play, and so it's coming from an experience of the religion or the belief system. Okay, in fact, I read in some studies that Shakespeare wasn't really very explicit about his affiliation. Of course, we may deduce that he may be following the Church of England, but there are certain studies that show he may be Catholic. He might be Catholic because of some of the plays, some of the themes that he explored in his plays. Of course, we have no time to go over those Catholic themes in his plays. Perhaps we can do some investigation later on that subject. Next slide, please. Unanswered questions still abound. These are the following. The following are unanswered questions. Where do we find in literature the religious components? You cannot separate one word from another word. You cannot separate one dialogue or one line from another. You cannot separate one character from the other. It follows a thread. It is one integrated whole. Should you break them into parts? It's difficult to do that. Should the religious factor in literature be identified in terms of traditional doctrine or heretical desire? Should the end or both? And is it about a doctrine or it's a particular heresy? Should it be associated with specific ideas about God, man, and the cosmos expressed in works of literature, or with generic actions like penance, adoration, or rebirth that are represented by works of literature? Because religion, belief is so huge. And how is the religious component accessible to critical scrutiny? And how adept are we in accessing it, scrutinizing it? Is it expressed in the themes of literature, dramatized in the motifs of literature, reflected in the structures of literature, inscribed in the forms of literature, or deposited in the languages of literature? It's very difficult to. So we need training, and we need. I think philosophy professors have certain literacy in that, being able to go over the different concepts of a particular theory and then apply them in certain texts. But of course, we need to take into consideration when it's applied on literature, how do we go about that? Therefore, the literature professor needs the help of theology scholars and philosophy scholars, and even scholars of culture to unravel that. It's really an interdisciplinary mind that is being honed here. Next slide, please. The issues that are worthy of more extensive discussion, according to Gunn, are the following. One, religion and literature, at least at certain times and in certain ways, have been historically related in fact and conceptually related in theory. So, historically related in fact, because as we've said, there was no literature in the ancient times, there was no art form in the ancient times, you only have belief. But conceptually related in theory. So they may help each other there. Number two, I'm sorry for that wrong numbering. The discipline of theology does not provide any special methodological access to works of literature. And the religious meaning of works of literature cannot be reduced to a specific set of theological ideas. So we're talking here of different methods of study. You have the method is found not in the other. For me, the method that we should develop and we should be good at is the method of our discipline, so that we can encroach on the method of the other. So be good in one's discipline, and then we can encroach on the method of the other. Let's say in this case, theology. So we do not have access to the method of study of theology. We do have access in the method of study of philosophy or the method of study of literature. So that it's very difficult to look at religious meaning of works of literature, and that they could not be reduced to a specific set of theological ideas. Therefore, we need literacy in this interdisciplinary engagement. I think it's more than literacy. We need expertise in this interdisciplinary engagement. I tried to teach the Bible as literature one semester. Very difficult, as I have students from ecclesiastical faculties. One is even a student of biblical theology. I said, I don't think I'm qualified to tackle the Bible as theology. Even if the Bible as literature, I can only talk about the meeting point. I cannot talk of the Bible as literature, the Bible as biblical, as theological text. I can only talk about the meeting point between them. In fact, it is one of the most difficult to teach. A long time ago, as a student in the graduate school, I took this subject. I have Dean Vasco as my classmate and two professor or two seminarians. One was then seminarian Father Marquez, now Father Marquez. Very difficult because on the one hand you have theology students and on the other you have philosophy students and another set of literature students. What I'm talking about is we should be literate at the meeting point. No, we should be very good at looking at the meeting point. We're not saying that we should be very good in theology. We're only saying that we should be good at where they met or where they meet and where they converge. That is a good starting point. Thirdly, if literature and religion belong to the same universe of meaning, they nonetheless constitute that universe and inhabit it in different ways. Literature employs meanings heuristically to show where they lead and how they matter. The religion employs meaning more parabolically to suggest where they came from, the origin of their authority, by clarifying the order of significance of mattering they intend. So let me unpack that. So if literature employs meanings heuristically applied on works, not as a whole bunch of theological uh, concepts, but as applied, no, to show where they lead and how they matter. So that's important, no, where they lead. So the and the mattering, no, it gives it leads to a certain body of images and words and expressions, representations. I would like to use the word representation. At least it's represented, no? For example, we always think of by the prodigal son by Rembrandt as one of those examples, no? Uh, Somehow we have a way of imagining it. We have a way of referring to it, um, embodied in a work of art. So it becomes heuristic in a way, because there is a representation. You have a father welcoming the prodigal son, and looking on, you look at the side of the painting, you have the other brother who's angry, no? Because, how could my father forgive this son who left the family and spent his inheritance and now coming back, and then you have my father welcoming him, ordering his servants to prepare a feast for this vagabond. And here I've always been beside my father. So, and then the father said, that's the point. You have always been with me. Your brother has been lost and now he is found. So Rembrandt gave us a representation of what is told, narrated in the Bible. But in the Bible, it was told as a parable. That's another form. And that's another literary form. a parable. Why did Jesus say that? And using the parable, he could have discussed that in a straightforward manner about forgiveness, about um, renunciation of the world, about reconciliation. He could have said that in a straightforward manner, but he used the parable, which is a literary genre, no? Because it becomes more poignant, it becomes more meaningful uh, to the listener in those times. So, why does religion talk about it parabolically? To suggest where they come from. Literature, it's not the job of literature to suggest where they come from. Literature is there to represent what happened. And from there, it leads you to the origin where it came from. But the job of theology is to suggest where they come from, the origin of their authority, who is the greater person, the person that forgives, and the true Father that forgives. You have the God the Father forgiving us. And so you have this Father forgiving his Son. So it's like a metaphor. It can be elevated into allegory. In fact, in St. Augustine, remember, St. Augustine has another word for it, anagogical. Therefore, that's how it works, no? By clarifying the order of significance of mattering they entail. That's why you have systematic theology. That's the job of systematic theology, to show where it came from, how it was prefigured in the Old Testament, and somehow realized in the New Testament. And Jesus is talking, no matter how many times you have seen went off the tracks, you can come back and you can be forgiven. The Father in heaven is like the Father in this picture, forgiving. So you have systematic theology there. But the art form is there to discuss that heuristically. Another thing here in this picture is the pilgrimage motif in Dante. Literature is not there to discuss what is the pilgrimage motif and where it came from. It is there to represent. And so Dante built the whole Divina Commedia in a form of a pilgrimage, starting with the dark wood. So he found himself in the middle of a forest, and then he entered hell. But of course, he was guided by Virgil. But Virgil, being pagan, came only until the gate and said, I will not enter. You will have to do it by yourself. The pilgrimage motif is very important to the medieval men. So, this motif you find in Dante, therefore, it is entrenched in medieval theology. But the job of literature is not to define where it came from, why pilgrimage, and so on and so forth, but to show that in a work that somehow uh, tells the story using the pilgrimage motif. And so when he ended with Paradiso, it's full circle. He completed the journey. Another way would be to interpret apocalyptic motifs, no? Literature will not explain to you that this is an apocalyptic novel. Why do you have movies about the end of the world? Armageddon, Apocalypse. Why do you have those? Of course, the movies will not tell you why. Systematic theology will tell you. But somehow these are drawing from those. literatures. And so you have this up expectation of the millennium, expectation of the end of times. And they are treated in apocalyptic motifs in those stained glass windows, in all of those novels where you have the Holocaust, and all of those films where you have the end of the world, and so on. The coming of the Antichrist, and so on. So you have these origins taken up by theology, but somehow you have the representation found in literature. Next slide, please. Number 4. If literature and religion are thus made of the same cultural material, namely meanings, both are meaning-making and serve the same experiential function. Of course, when we enter the church, we feel close to God. But the experience of literature is somehow an extension, with art giving us sublimation, giving us comfort sometimes, but it's not religion. It is only one of the expressions of our belief. So, if they have the same cultural language, they have the same function, perhaps experientially, to help us understand and negotiate through symbols our relations with our environment, both spiritual and material. How do we deal with this? Both the study of both in conjunction as of each individually is a form of cultural studies, and one that offers no immunity from the methodological demands and constraints placed on all students of culture. So, the merger of both, okay, is cultural studies. And I think philosophy can help in this interchange, in this interrelationship, because you have this new form, this engagement, this dual engagement becomes cultural studies. As cultural studies, both are manifestations of culture. But that doesn't mean we are reducing the theological concepts into mere culture. Of course not, because that's part of our belief. But somehow they are material of our culture. So therefore, they can be treated, the intersection, not separately, the intersection can be treated as cultural studies. And so we can approach the interrelationship as cultural studies, and one that offers no immunity from the methodological demands and constraints placed on all students of culture. So when we enter into this kind of study, of course, we are being asked to be good in both the domains that we are studying. Plus, we should be good at the point of intersection. We can use utilize some of those concepts from cultural studies in studying this convergence.